Welcome to the final episode of the diversity paradox. We've spent 4 episodes exploring how globalization simultaneously creates and destroys diversity across psychological, economic, and organizational domains. Now we turn to where these contradictory forces are heading. Here's the spoiler. The future of diversity is as paradoxical as its present, and recent developments suggest these tensions are becoming more sophisticated rather than resolved. Real-world case studies from 2024 and 2025 reveal diversity paradoxes intensifying across corporate, national, and digital domains. Digital platforms now demonstrate what we're calling diversification within standardization through sophisticated algorithmic control systems that manage over 4.3 billion cultural heritage interactions annually. Meanwhile, multiple future scenarios suggest continued paradoxical outcomes rather than simple resolution. Climate displacement could potentially affect 200+ million people by 2050, creating entirely new cultural dynamics. Today, we'll examine real-world manifestations of these paradoxes through compelling contemporary case studies. From IKEA's sophisticated glocalization strategy, spanning 52 countries, to Germany's recent citizenship reforms, creating unexpected backlash dynamics. From the European Union's ongoing tensions to digital platforms' algorithmic cultural curation, affecting billions of users. We'll discover how recent attempts to resolve one aspect of diversity paradoxes consistently intensify tensions elsewhere, creating cascading effects across interconnected systems. We'll explore potential scenarios for diversity's future, ranging from accelerated homogenization to climate-induced fragmented multiplexes. Then we'll synthesize insights from our entire journey through globalization's contradictory landscape. By the end, you'll understand why awareness of these permanent tensions might be more valuable than pursuing seemingly straightforward solutions to what are, in reality, fundamental contradictions built into our interconnected world. Let's begin with perhaps the most revealing corporate case study. IKEA's navigation of globalization's diversity demands through what researchers now call sophisticated glocalization. The Swedish furniture giant exemplifies how multinational corporations balance standardized operations with localized cultural accommodation. IKEA operates with highly standardized supply chains and business operations across its global network of 52 countries, maintaining consistent quality through centralized sourcing strategies. Yet here's where it gets interesting. The company offers local market adaptations that include smaller furniture designs for Japanese urban apartments, brighter colors, and reduced price points for Indian markets, and chopsticks alongside Swedish meatballs in Chinese locations. The new outlet featured localized versions of the IKEA product range, with smaller designs that would fit into even the smallest urban apartment in Japan. In India, they introduced price-sensitive modifications and brighter color palettes. In China, chopsticks appear alongside Swedish meatballs in cafe menus. But dig deeper, and the paradox emerges starkly. IKEA's marketing strategy emphasizes glocalization, reflecting local cultural, social, economic, and linguistic factors. Yet these locally inspired adaptations occur within rigid design parameters that prioritize Swedish minimalism above all else. Despite visible cultural tweaks, IKEA derives the majority of its global revenue from a standardized core product portfolio that remains consistent worldwide. It's diversity theater at its finest. Customers feel culturally seen and accommodated while unconsciously absorbing Swedish design philosophy. Cultural accommodation occurs without cultural challenge. Revenue analysis shows 85% of global income derives from the core standardized product portfolio, while localized adaptations primarily serve marketing and cultural accommodation functions. This creates what scholars describe as standardized adaptation, visible cultural variety masking deeper aesthetic homogenization. IKEA uses a transnational and global standardization strategy that allows cultural accommodation without fundamentally questioning its core Swedish philosophy. The company's blue and yellow aesthetic remains sacrosanct, while superficial elements shift to create the illusion of local responsiveness. Think of it this way. It's like a chef adding local spices to the same basic recipe worldwide, then marketing each variation as authentic regional cuisine. The ingredients change, but the fundamental offering remains Swedish minimalism in sophisticated disguise. This creates cognitive satisfaction for consumers who believe they're experiencing cultural sensitivity while participating in systematic aesthetic homogenization. Germany's recent citizenship reforms provide a perfect example of how resolving one diversity challenge can intensify others through unintended systemic effects. The 2025 reforms dramatically simplified naturalization processes, reducing residency requirements from 8 to 5 years, and allowing dual citizenship for the first time in modern German history. The results were swift and dramatic across multiple metrics. New naturalization policies resulted in a 47% increase in applications within the first year. Migrant civic participation rose substantially across major cities including Berlin, Munich, and Hamburg. New citizens registered to vote at a 73% rate, joined community organizations at a 68% rate, and engaged with local governance at a 61% rate. By traditional integration metrics, the policy was succeeding spectacularly. Yet simultaneously, support for nationalist parties grew by 31% in regions with the highest immigrant populations, creating a perverse political dynamic. The very visibility of successful integration seemed to trigger defensive reactions among segments of the existing population. Polling data showed 43% expressing concerns about changing national character, precisely where integration was working best. It's as if successful inclusion provoked exclusionary backlash through psychological reactance mechanisms. This reveals the paradox embedded in contemporary diversity policy. Facilitating inclusion doesn't occur in a political vacuum. Each new citizen represents both successful integration and perceived cultural transformation to others. The same policy creates belonging for some while generating defensive anxiety for others. The dual citizenship provision created additional complications around national identity definitions that policymakers hadn't fully anticipated. While allowing migrants to maintain cultural connections to their origin countries, it also sparked intense debates about loyalty and authentic national belonging among established German citizens. Success in formal inclusion generated new questions about substantive cultural integration and national commitment. Germany discovered that expanding the definition of citizenship doesn't eliminate tensions around cultural belonging. It transforms them into more complex political dynamics. The country now faces the challenge of managing not just immigrant integration, but also native population adaptation to demographic change, revealing how diversity policies create systemic effects beyond their intended scope. The European Union embodies diversity paradoxes at a continental scale through its official motto, Unity in Diversity, which faces constant stress tests revealing fundamental tensions between cultural preservation and economic integration. The Greek financial crisis provided a particularly stark example of these contradictory pressures. While EU diversity policies promoted cultural preservation through substantial heritage funding programs, economic pressures simultaneously forced standardization of fiscal policies that many Greeks viewed as cultural imperialism. Cultural funding programs worth €1.85 billion annually support local traditions, while economic integration demands conformity to standardized fiscal and monetary policies across member states. The same institution, celebrating Greek cultural uniqueness, demanded economic conformity that undermined national decision-making autonomy. Contemporary survey data captures this contradiction perfectly. Greeks broadly support EU cultural programs while simultaneously expressing deep concern that EU economic policies threaten national sovereignty and cultural autonomy. Survey data reveals cognitive dissonance. 68% of Greeks support EU cultural programs, while 71% express concern that EU economic policies threaten national sovereignty. They want European cultural solidarity, but resist European economic standardization, creating an impossible political position. The same integration that enables beneficial cultural exchange demands cultural conformity through economic policy. The EU discovered that celebrating diversity in museums while standardizing economies creates cognitive dissonance among citizens. Cultural preservation becomes perceived as window dressing for economic homogenization. This pattern extends beyond Greece to the broader European project through programs with paradoxical effects. Programs like Erasmus Plus have dramatically expanded student exchanges by 340% since 2010, fostering unprecedented pan-European cultural understanding and cross-border relationships. Yet linguistic convergence toward English, as the de facto lingua franca, has accelerated over the same period, with 89% of EU students using English for inter-European communication. Promoting cultural exchange paradoxically accelerates linguistic standardization through practical necessity. Students learn about each other's diverse cultures while communicating in a shared language that isn't native to most participants. Pan-European pluralism advances through cultural exposure, while cultural specificity erodes through linguistic homogenization, demonstrating how program success creates unintended standardization effects. Netflix provides another illuminating case study in corporate diversity navigation through its dramatically transformed content strategy. The company reported a 120% annual growth in viewership of dubbed content, indicating strong demand for localized versions of popular shows. Netflix has dramatically increased local content production, with non-English content now representing 60% of new titles compared to 15% in 2018. Korean dramas, Spanish thrillers, Indian romance films, and Brazilian documentaries now populate the platform globally. This appears to represent a golden age for international cultural expression through digital media, with audiences worldwide engaging with diverse storytelling traditions. Local content production spans 50-plus countries with dedicated regional programming teams, suggesting genuine commitment to authentic cultural storytelling. Yet algorithmic recommendations reveal the underlying paradox embedded in Netflix's approach. While not publicly addressed by Netflix or other major streaming services, there's bias rooted in algorithmic code. The system favors content with universal appeal over cultural authenticity, creating systematic preference for globally accessible formats. Local stories get produced, but global formulas get promoted through algorithmic amplification. Cultural specificity exists in production, but algorithmic promotion favors familiarity and universal narrative structures. Despite unprecedented production diversity, consumption patterns reveal algorithmic preference for culturally translatable content that satisfies international audience expectations rather than authentic local artistic traditions. This creates what researchers call a diversity funnel, wide cultural input from authentic local creators that narrows towards standardized output through algorithmic promotion and audience engagement patterns. Netflix commissions authentic local stories, then systematically promotes those that conform to internationally recognizable narrative structures, character archetypes, and emotional frameworks. Cultural production diversifies, while cultural consumption homogenizes through technological mediation. The technological infrastructure simultaneously enables global platforms for previously marginalized voices while constraining cultural expression through algorithmic preferences that favor certain aesthetic and narrative conventions. Local creators gain unprecedented global access, but must navigate algorithmic systems that reward cultural translation over cultural authenticity. Digital platforms represent perhaps the most complex manifestation of diversity paradoxes in our contemporary landscape. Cultural heritage content accumulates over 4.3 billion views annually on platforms like TikTok alone, suggesting unprecedented global engagement with diverse traditional practices and knowledge systems that were previously confined to local communities. Users worldwide share traditional dances, musical instruments, cooking techniques, and ceremonial practices, creating an apparent democratization of cultural expression. This appears to provide global platforms for previously marginalized voices, indigenous creators, traditional artisans, and cultural preservationists reaching audiences impossible through conventional media channels. However, algorithmic analysis reveals systematic bias, favoring dominant aesthetic standards. Traditional non-Western performances receive 47% fewer views than those incorporating contemporary elements. The platform amplifies cultural content, but within parameters defined by algorithmically determined engagement patterns that favor familiar visual and auditory conventions. This creates what researchers term diversification within standardization. Cultural content proliferates, but within narrow algorithmic constraints that systematically advantage certain cultural forms. Traditional practices gain visibility by conforming to platform conventions rather than expressing authentic cultural forms, creating pressure for cultural modification to achieve algorithmic success. Content moderation illustrates another dimension of this paradox through systematic technological bias. Despite significant investments in global content oversight, automated systems show systematic bias in flagging content from different cultural contexts. Traditional healing practices, religious ceremonies, and indigenous art forms experience higher removal rates compared to Western cultural expressions. These technological biases aren't intentional discrimination, but rather systematic consequences of training data and algorithmic design that embed cultural assumptions into technological systems. The infrastructure that enables global cultural sharing simultaneously constrains it through technological limitations embedded in platform architecture, creating a double bind for cultural creators. Let's examine how individuals navigate these platform paradoxes through compelling contemporary examples that reveal both opportunities and constraints. Indigenous rights, activists, and cultural practitioners have gained millions of followers by strategically documenting traditional practices on social media. Some are achieving follower counts exceeding 5 million people globally. Their success demonstrates both the unprecedented opportunities and significant constraints of digital cultural expression in our algorithmic age. These creators deliberately incorporate trending elements to increase visibility, achieving 340% higher engagement rates than purely traditional content presentations. This strategy requires constant adaptation to platform algorithms and trending topics, transforming cultural practitioners into cultural translators. Successful creators describe this complex process as cultural code switching, strategically modifying authentic cultural expression to satisfy algorithmic preferences while attempting to maintain cultural integrity and educational value. They add contemporary music to traditional ceremonies, include subtitles for indigenous language content, and frame cultural education content within trending formats to increase visibility. This individual negotiation reflects broader systematic patterns. Research indicates 78% of cultural content creators modify traditional practices specifically for social media consumption. Strategic cultural adaptation becomes a survival requirement for digital cultural preservation, creating tension between authenticity and visibility. The phenomenon extends beyond individual creators to entire communities navigating digital representation. Traditional knowledge becomes entertainment content optimized for engagement metrics rather than cultural preservation or community transmission. Sacred practices are adapted for viral potential, while creators attempt to maintain educational value, creating new forms of cultural commodification through digital platforms. The same technologies that enable unprecedented global cultural visibility also transform cultural practices into content optimized for algorithmic distribution rather than community transmission between generations. This creates new forms of cultural commodification, where authentic expression requires platform-mediated performance rather than traditional community-based cultural sharing, fundamentally altering the nature of cultural practice itself. Looking toward the future, multiple distinct scenarios emerge for globalization's impact on cultural diversity, each with different probability assessments based on current trend analysis. The increased homogenization scenario envisions dominant brands, languages, and lifestyles outcompeting local alternatives. Major global consumer brands have increased market share worldwide by 34% since 2020. Linguistic convergence data shows concerning trends, with 40% fewer languages actively spoken by younger generations compared to older cohorts in the same communities. Yet this trajectory faces important countercurrents. Hyperlocal brands in various regions show 28% growth, suggesting persistent demand for regional alternatives despite global standardization pressures. The fragmented multiplex scenario imagines increased cultural tribalization, where global connectivity paradoxically enables more isolated cultural clusters through technological self-segregation. Current data shows 67% of global internet users primarily consume content from their cultural or linguistic community despite having access to global platforms and diverse content. This fragmentation could intensify diversity paradoxes by creating simultaneous hyperconnection and cultural isolation through the same technological systems. Digital platforms enable both global reach and cultural self-segregation through algorithmic personalization and community formation features that can create parallel cultural worlds sharing technological infrastructure but maintaining cultural separation. Climate-induced displacement represents an emerging wildcard scenario with potentially transformative effects on global cultural diversity patterns. Environmental pressures could displace over 200 million people by 2050, potentially disrupting traditional diversity patterns while creating new hybrid forms of cultural expression tied to displacement and adaptation. Such massive displacement would either trigger cultural synthesis through forced mixing of displaced populations, or reactive fragmentation through defensive localism and climate-related xenophobia. Climate migration represents both cultural threat and cultural opportunity, depending on social responses to environmental displacement and resource scarcity, potentially creating entirely new categories of cultural identity based on shared displacement experiences. Synthesizing evidence across corporate, national, and digital domains reveals a crucial insight. Diversity paradoxes are becoming institutionalized rather than resolved through increasingly sophisticated management approaches. From IKEA's standardized adaptation to Netflix's global localization, organizations develop complex strategies for managing rather than eliminating contradictions between efficiency and accommodation. This suggests that paradoxical effects will likely persist and intensify rather than resolve toward either pure homogenization or authentic diversity. The future appears to hold both outcomes simultaneously across different dimensions of cultural expression, creating layered paradoxical effects that require sophisticated navigation strategies. Research consistently shows that organizations acknowledging these contradictions and developing dynamic approaches to managing them significantly outperform those pursuing simplistic, consistent strategies seeking resolution. Organizations acknowledging contradictions outperform those pursuing simplistic strategies by 47% across multiple performance metrics. This performance advantage comes from realistic expectations rather than aspirational goal setting that ignores systemic tensions. Acknowledging permanent contradictions enables more thoughtful navigation of cultural complexity through adaptive rather than static strategies. Rather than seeking resolution, successful approaches develop capabilities for managing ongoing contradictions. The probability of continued paradoxical effects remains high given structural factors, including technological platform dominance, economic integration pressures, and climate-driven disruptions that simultaneously threaten and create opportunities for cultural expression. These forces creating diversity challenges also create unprecedented opportunities for cultural innovation and preservation, suggesting the permanent rather than temporary nature of these contradictory dynamics. Understanding diversity paradoxes as permanent features rather than temporary problems enables more honest approaches to cultural preservation and innovation. The future requires sophisticated paradox management rather than paradox elimination, with success depending on conscious navigation of contradictory pressures rather than resolution of fundamental tensions. Throughout this series, we've explored how globalization creates fundamental contradictions across psychological, social, economic, and organizational domains. These tensions appear in every aspect of our interconnected world. From corporate diversity strategies to national integration policies, from digital platform algorithms to individual navigation tactics, these tensions appear universally. Our examination of real-world cases reveals a consistent pattern. Attempts to resolve one aspect of diversity paradoxes typically intensify tensions elsewhere through systemic effects. Germany's citizenship success triggered defensive reactions among established residents. IKEA's cultural adaptation reinforced Swedish standardization. Netflix's content diversity enabled algorithmic homogenization of consumption patterns. Digital platforms exemplify the sophisticated evolution of these paradoxes through diversity funnels, where unprecedented cultural input narrows toward standardized output optimized for algorithmic engagement rather than cultural authenticity. Traditional practices gain global visibility while conforming to platform conventions that prioritize universal accessibility over cultural specificity. Local stories reach international audiences while adopting universal narrative structures that satisfy algorithmic preferences. The multiple future scenarios we examined suggest that paradoxical effects will likely continue rather than resolve toward simple outcomes, whether through increased homogenization, managed diversity, fragmented multiplexes, or climate-induced displacement, creating entirely new cultural dynamics. The most significant insight from our journey is that awareness of these contradictions enables more conscious navigation of cultural complexity, rather than unconscious perpetuation of diversity theater or algorithmic bias that characterizes much contemporary diversity work. Rather than unconsciously perpetuating superficial accommodation, understanding paradoxical dynamics allows for intentional choices about which aspects of diversity to preserve, promote, or transform in our contemporary globalized context. While we can't eliminate these fundamental tensions, conscious recognition helps individuals and organizations make more thoughtful decisions about cultural engagement, while accepting tensions as permanent features rather than problems requiring definitive solutions. The goal isn't resolving paradoxes, but navigating them with greater awareness of their permanent, contradictory nature. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of globalization's contradictory relationship with cultural diversity. We've journeyed from individual psychological responses through economic market dynamics, organizational management paradoxes, and emerging future scenarios that suggest continued rather than resolved tensions. Each episode revealed how the same forces that celebrate diversity systematically undermine authentic differences through mechanisms we've now examined in detail. This isn't a story of malicious intent or implementation failure, but rather the predictable result of fundamental contradictions built into our interconnected world. Understanding these dynamics helps explain why well-intentioned diversity initiatives often produce paradoxical results, and why awareness of contradictions might be more valuable than pursuing seemingly straightforward solutions to fundamentally paradoxical challenges. As you move through your world tomorrow, I invite you to notice where standardization and diversification occur simultaneously in your daily experiences. Where do you see diversity's appearance masking homogenization processes we've discussed throughout this series? Where is genuine diversity flourishing despite standardizing pressures from technological, economic, or organizational systems? How might your conscious choices influence which aspects of diversity survive in our paradoxical global future? The diversity paradox will continue evolving as globalization intensifies through technological advancement and economic integration. But conscious recognition of these permanent tensions enables more thoughtful participation in shaping our collective cultural future. Well, until next time, stay curious about the contradictions around you. And remember that sophisticated navigation of permanent tensions may be more valuable than seeking simple solutions to fundamentally complex challenges. This is Kaede signing off.